Biology and the mind, structure and function of the nervous system, feedback loops. All right, from outside in, top to bottom, we are on the 4th PowerPoint in this little series. First video here is homeostasis and positive and negative feedback loops. The endocrine system is one of the greatest feedback loop systems that there is. The interconnectedness between the brain and multiple organ systems is responsible for every response and reaction in our body. So to begin, go back and watch that video explaining homeostasis and those negative and positive feedbacks, and then think about how all of these things interconnect and interact in all of the functions that we have and how the different parts of our nervous system are interacting and responding minute by minute, second by second, every single day of our lives. So for some of you, this is a refresher. Again, watching the PowerPoint, taking any notes where you think is necessary, using this information, again, in a global sense, as we move through the understanding in these various modules. So the pituitary gland, of course, most people know is referred to as the master gland. And this is the release of stimulating hormones into the bloodstream. And the names of the hormones contain the target or purpose. For example, TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone, FSH is follicle stimulating hormone, and they go to their different target organs and create target responses. The thyroid and the parathyroid, the thymus, the adrenal glands are really important when we start talking more about trauma and trauma responses. So remember that the adrenals have a cortex and a medulla. The cortex is made up of 3 zones which produce hormones that help to regulate various physiologic states. There are the mineralocorticoids, which is salt balance and blood volume, glucocorticoids, which help to regulate glucose metabolism, the androgens, of which cholesterol is the precursor, and are hormones that are related to sex characteristics like development of breast tissue, body hair, and overall growth. The medulla, or the center part, makes catecholamines like epinephrine and norepinephrine, and peptides, which are things like somatostatin and substance P. Of course, we've got our pancreas, the ovaries, and testes. These are a bunch of hormones and their functions. So again, for a lot of you, this is just purely review, so I'm not going to belabor the point on all of them. If this information is new or stuck way back in those dusty recesses of your mind, I encourage you to pause the presentation and read over each one of these. It's not super important that you commit them to memory, but to be familiar with some of the names, especially in later modules when we talk about things like bonding, addiction, and trauma. I wanted to include the piece about the enteric nervous system. It's actually a division of the peripheral nervous system. And again, I mention it here in feedback loops because of the importance that it plays in how we respond and react to stimuli and how interconnected it is to most other daily functions. So the enteric nervous system is really the entire gastrointestinal tract, small and large intestines. So it's innervated by both the sympathetic and parasympathetic neural components. Remember that the sympathetics are things like fight or flight, right? And what ends up happening when the sympathetics are activated, it actually slows or stops digestion. When the parasympathetic nervous system is activated, it actually is that rest and digest piece, which is more conducive to digestion. Don't forget about peristalsis, which is the movement of the contents through the bowels, and this is done through musculature that runs longitudinally and circularly around the entire digestive tract. We've got neurotransmitters that are really important, the acetylcholine, serotonin, and dopamine. All of these have been discussed previously. And then one thing that I want to call everybody's attention to really be sure to have an awareness of this, about the inner space that is composed of the villi and the microvilli. So the best way that I think about this is it's like a hand in a rubber glove inside of a fuzzy glove. So the hand is the lymphatic tissue. The rubber glove are the arteries and veins that cover the lymphatic tissue. And then the next glove is the villi, with the fuzz being the microvilli. Something to remember is that the large intestine, it contains the largest amount of lymphatic tissue any place else in our body. So this is really important when it comes to overall health, is really dependent on how well our gastrointestinal tract is functioning. So there is a study here that I've included that are implications of the neurodegenerative disorder Parkinson's and how that interrelates with the enteric nervous system. I encourage you to take some time to do a quick read on this and to kind of supplement the information here. The hypothalamus, in particular the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, which a lot of people I'm sure have heard about, is specifically the adrenal glands and things when it comes to responding to stress, both acute and chronic. It's really, this is going to become more important when we start talking about, again, about things like trauma, addiction, and other mental health issues. I'm hoping that everybody has at least heard of the general adaptation syndrome, which was developed by Dr. Hans Selye back in the 1940s. He was an Austrian physician who studied and researched how mammals respond to stress. His work really rose to the level of nominee for the Nobel Prize in 1949, and he developed, again, this general adaptation syndrome, which was groundbreaking in the understanding of the stress response. So there's three phases. There are biologic changes that create an enlargement in the adrenal glands when we are responding to stress, so that we have access to adrenaline to help us with that fight or flight response, big muscle groups, activation, those kinds of things. Another aspect of this general adaptation syndrome is that there's actually a suppression of the immune response. And a third phase of this is the inflammation of the gastrointestinal tract. So the three primary phases are the recognition, adaptation, and exhaustion. So in recognition, it is preparation to protect. That again is the release, the enlargement of the adrenal glands for the release of adrenaline. The adaptation, it's also sometimes referred to as resistance, is about biological and behavioral changes. It's the body's attempt to return physiologic states to normal levels. It's often unsuccessful, and that can lead to the third stage, which is exhaustion. It's an alteration in function where there is an increase in susceptibility to dysfunction and disease states. So this isn't without criticism, of course. It's been around for a very long time. The criticism of the model or theory is the missing recovery phase. However, Selye's work has led the way for many discoveries and a greater understanding of what happens physiologically under both acute and chronic stress. So it's really worth some exploration. He wrote a book back in the 1970s that is called The Stress of Life. I highly recommend everyone have a copy of it and read a copy. It's a pretty short book, so it's pretty easy to get through. One thing I want to talk about here for a moment kind of is built on the foundation of some of Selye's work. This is the 5 self-protective responses, which has been adapted here by me from some work from Dr. Peter Levine, who was the creator of somatic experiencing, which is a therapeutic approach to helping people when there has been negative physiologic responses to stressors, primarily shock trauma. This will be discussed in later modules, but I want to introduce them here to connect the brain and body responses and how they may relate to feedback loops in times of real or perceived threat. So really the first thing that ends up happening is something that's called arrest and startle. It's our natural automatic response to something startling. So it's that quick inhale when somebody jumps out of around a corner, or you hear a loud bang. So it's like, it's that kind of response. The part of the brain that is activated for this primarily is the locus ceruleus. This is an early warning system. There is a huge release of norepinephrine. So it can end result in shallow breathing as a result of that fight or flight response of the sympathetic nervous system and the need for a large amount of oxygen quickly. So the problem is if relax doesn't happen, long-term breathing issues can result, and the parasympathetic nervous system never takes over, if you will. The sympathetic nervous system is kind of always on. There can be digestive issues. So primarily with constipation, again, because if that sympathetic nervous system has been activated, the blood is moving from the digestive organs out to the big muscle groups so that you can protect yourself, right? So we take the enteric nervous system into consideration. So if you're stuck in arrest and startle and there is no relax, your digestive system is not going to waste the energy. So the resources go out to those large muscle groups, again, for that fight or flight. What happens is that people can get stuck here and they are always on alert. The second phase is what's called defensive orienting, and this is an activation of the amygdala, which helps to evaluate content, and it is in the formation of implicit memories. What happens here is that muscles, primarily of the head and neck, stiffen up because this is where a majority of our sense organs are, right? So our eyes, we look, our nose, we smell, we want to hear where the potential danger is coming from, or to make eye contact with that being to determine if it is a potential threat. It's also part of where we think about getting ready to fight or flee. The hippocampus is related to cognitive or explicit memory. This is the area of the brain that gets triggered to help determine through memory if there is a familiar sound, if it's a familiar smell or person or animal, or if this is something that needs or warrants the fight or flight response. The orbitofrontal cortex helps us to organize responses to threat. So it's kind of this automatic reaction. Can I run or fight? Should I run or fight? Or does the freeze or befriend response kick in? This is not under conscious control. When we are threatened, real or imagined, or under stress, we will revert back to our most successful survival strategy. It is not a conscious decision. Now, the anterior cingulate gyrus functions as a response modulator in a healthy, non-traumatized individual. This response will be tempered appropriately for the event. So if someone has unresolved trauma that's stuck in their physiology, they will either over or underreact. You can kind of think about this when it comes to behavioral issues that appear to be an overreaction to something that may appear to be mildly stimulating. These areas are implicated in complex cognitive functions like empathy, impulse control, emotion regulation, and decision making. The third phase is mobilization, which is where the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis kicks in. Remember, the hypothalamus is a sort of relay in the brain. A signal reaches the hypothalamus, which triggers the pituitary to send stimulating hormones to the adrenals to release adrenaline, to respond to the real or imagined threat in an attempt to ensure survival. Again, not under conscious control. So one thing I want you to think about is that shaky feeling that you might get when your car is sliding along a frozen, snow-covered street towards an intersection or another car or some kind of other immovable object, but there is no impact or real negative impact, if you will. So there is a chemical reaction in your big muscle groups that creates that shaky feeling because that's your muscles priming to run away, to fight or flee, to help you manage that dangerous situation. When the energy is not discharged, we can have difficulty sitting still, we can have digestive issues, just to name a few. So the fourth stage of this is called completion. So this is a parasympathetic activation. It's a Oh, it's like that big exhale. It's that big breath that when we have successfully fought or fled or otherwise properly assessed the situation as not needing a fight or flight response. Somehow we have survived the threat, and ideally what happens is we shake, laugh, or cry and move on to the next phase, which is integration. This is where memory consolidation takes place about the event. Here, the successful survival response is encoded in our memory banks for the next time that we are in the same or a similar situation. So one of the best things that we can do is to shake our arms and legs, take a big breath, laugh, cry, to dissipate those chemicals and the energetic charge that is thankfully not needed. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is that we often override this natural response. You know, there's no blood, there's no broken bones, there's no smashed up car parts, but a lack of dissipation of this response can remain stuck in our physiology, causing long-term issues. Just to point out some brain structures, the blue lines on this picture are of the locus ceruleus, which is the dispersal of norepinephrine, which is that naturally occurring chemical in our body. It's that main neurotransmitter that's used by the sympathetic nervous system to help us activate our bodily response to stressful or threatening situations. I just want you to take a moment to pause the recording and note the other areas in the brain that are connected and the proximity. I wanted to put in a piece in here about the Papez circuit, which has undergone, it's been around for a while, it's undergone some recent discoveries. It is truly central to the understanding the neural circuits of emotion and emotional expression. It's really involved in consolidation of declarative memory, and those declarative memories are the ones that we can speak about. They're part of our conscious awareness and understanding of things. And there is the reference here. You can copy and paste that and bring up that article. Moving on to the motivation and reward circuits, which will be talked about more when we speak about trauma and addiction. A video here of a man by the name of Judson Brewer. It's a short video about a simple way to break some bad habits. Again, I encourage you to pause the PowerPoint and take a look, read over some of the context on here and notice the areas where the lines and the connections in the different parts of the brain. So in summary, the human body works through feedback loops, primarily with the endocrine system and associated hormones. It acts to create responses to both those internal and external bodily environments. The enteric nervous system and how that relates to overall health and other states in our body. The HPA axis and its importance in the stress response, and those 5 self-protective responses and the connection to innate survival reactions. Of course, those brain structures and the Papez circuits in understanding a bit about memory, emotions, and responses to stress, and then, of course, the maintenance through homeostatic control. And, of course, your references.